You are not going to believe the audacity of the heroine in today's story. Imagine looking a lichen king in the eye and telling him to hush. That is exactly what we're getting into today. But before we step into the Lichen King's territory, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. It helps our pack grow and ensures you never miss a new release. I want this comment section to be buzzing today. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? And while you listen, timestamp your favorite parts. If a scene makes you laugh or swoon, let me know right when it happens. Are you ready? Let's get into the story. In a world where silence was a survival strategy for the weak, Marin had mastered the art of being invisible. She was the dust on the shelves, the shadow in the corner, the archivist who never spoke out of turn. But everyone has a breaking point. For Marin, it was not a battlefield or a duel that pushed her over the edge. It was a deadline in the Grand Library and a stranger who refused to stop pacing. She did not know the intruder was the lethal Lichen King, a man whose temper could level cities. She only knew he was loud. One command would change her life forever, turning the predator's gaze directly on her. She told Death to hush, and Death merely grinned. Chapter 1. The Midnight Archivist. The Grand Library was usually a sanctuary of absolute stillness, a place where the only sounds were the settling of ancient stone and the rhythmic turning of parchment pages. For Marin, this vast cathedral of knowledge was more than just a workplace. It was the only place in the Summit Fortress where an Omega was not constantly looking over her shoulder or dodging the cruel taunts of the elite. But tonight, the silence was fraying at the edges, torn apart by a tension she could not name. The heavy clock on the western wall chimed the second hour of the morning, a deep and mournful sound that vibrated through the floorboards and settled in her bones. Marin rubbed her tired eyes, her fingers stained with black ink, trying desperately to focus on the blurred script of the peace treaty spread out before her. The High Council demanded these records be finalized and duplicated by sunrise, and she was nowhere near finished with the translation. Just as she dipped her quill to correct a critical mistranslation regarding border disputes, the sound returned to shatter her focus. It started as a low, repetitive thudding, the heavy tread of military boots pacing back and forth in the restricted section of the mezzanine directly above her. It had been going on for 20 minutes, a relentless, aggressive rhythm that echoed off the vaulted ceilings and drilled into her skull. Whoever was up there had absolutely no regard for the sanctity of the archives or the people trying to preserve history within them. Marin gripped her quill tighter, her knuckles turning white as she tried to force the ancient words to make sense. She had tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just a restless guard, or perhaps a scholar lost in thought. But the sheer aggression in the footsteps suggested something far more volatile than academic frustration. Then the pacing stopped, replaced by a sound that made the fine hair on her arms stand up in warning. A low, vibrating rumble echoed from the shadows of the upper balcony, resonating through the wood of her desk. It was not just a noise. It was a physical sensation that rattled the glass in the lantern beside her hand. It was the sound of a beast fighting for control, a predator expressing frustration in a way that should have sent any sensible wolf running for the nearest exit. But Marin was not sensible tonight. She was sleep-deprived, anxious, and functioning on stale caffeine and sheer panic about her looming deadline. The growl deepened, becoming a constant grating distortion that made it impossible to think, let alone translate complex diplomatic legalese. The sheer arrogance of someone making such a racket in a place of study fueled a fire in her belly that overrode her natural instinct for self-preservation. Her patience snapped like a brittle twig in a winter storm. Pushing her heavy oak chair back with a scrape that sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet room, Marin marched toward the spiral staircase that led to the upper levels. She did not stop to consider that the restricted section was reserved for high-ranking alphas and visiting dignitaries. She did not pause to think about her lack of defensive skills or her lowly status in the pack hierarchy. All she cared about was the silence she required to finish her work so she could finally sleep. She ascended the iron stairs, the metal cold beneath her hands, her frustration mounting with every step she took toward the source of the disturbance. The growling grew louder as she climbed, rolling over her in waves of dark, agitated energy that smelled faintly of wood smoke and rain. Reaching the top landing, she spotted the source of the disturbance immediately. A massive figure stood near the railing, his back to her, silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the high, arched windows. He was towering, radiating a heat and tension that made the space around him feel charged with static electricity. He was muttering to himself, a litany of harsh curses that dissolved into another one of those room-shaking rumbles that vibrated in Marin's chest. Marin did not hesitate, her exhaustion stripping away her filter. She stomped her foot on the metal grating, the sharp sound cutting through his noise like a knife. The figure froze, the growl dying in his throat as the library fell deadly silent. Marin crossed her arms over her chest, channeling every ounce of authority she possessed as a senior librarian. She took a breath and spoke clearly into the darkness. "Excuse me, I do not care who you are or what has upset you, but you need to be quiet. Some of us are actually trying to work." Chapter 2. The Command. The silence that followed Marin's outbursts was heavier than the stone walls surrounding them. It was not the peaceful quiet of the library she cherished, but a suffocating stillness that preceded a catastrophe. The massive figure at the railing stopped moving completely, his shoulders stiffening under the dark fabric of his coat. For a terrifying moment, Marin wondered if she had made a fatal error, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The logical part of her brain finally caught up with her exhaustion, screaming that she had just barked an order at a high-ranking alpha in the middle of the night. She braced herself for a shout, a strike, or at the very least, a cruel dismissal that would see her fired by morning. She squeezed her eyes shut for a heartbeat, waiting for the inevitable explosion of temper that alphas were so famous for, but the blow never came. Instead, the stranger turned slowly, moving with a predatory grace that made the large space feel suddenly claustrophobic. When the moonlight finally hit his face, the air left Marin's lungs in a painful rush. It was a face she had seen on coins, banners, and statues throughout the city, though those lifeless depictions failed to capture the raw, terrifying intensity of the man standing before her. King Valerius Stallone looked nothing like the diplomatic portraits. He looked lethal. A jagged scar ran down the side of his jaw, and his eyes were dark pools of agitation that seemed to burn with an inner fire. He was not just an alpha, he was the ruler of them all, the man whose beast was rumored to be so volatile that he had leveled a fortress during the last war. Marin realized with horrifying clarity that she had just told the Lycan King to shut up. Valerius took a step toward her, the metal grating of the floor groaning under his weight. He did not look angry, which was almost worse. He looked fascinated, like a wolf that had stumbled upon a rabbit with sharp teeth. He tilted his head to the side, studying her as if she were a complex riddle written in a language he had not heard in centuries. The growl that had been shaking the library floor moments ago had vanished, replaced by a strange, heavy focus that pinned her to the spot. Madden wanted to run, to apologize, to drop to her knees and beg for forgiveness, but her pride and the lingering adrenaline kept her feet planted firmly on the ground. She gripped her own arms, trying to stop the trembling that threatened to give away her terror. The king closed the distance between them until he was looming over her, blocking out the moonlight. He smelled of cold iron and the deep woods after a storm, a scent that was overwhelming in its intensity. He leaned down, invading her personal space until his face was inches from hers. His lips curled into a slow, dangerous grin that showed a hint of elongated canines. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low rumble that vibrated through the floor and straight into the soles of her feet. "You want me to be quiet, little librarian?" he asked, the words dark and teasing. He leaned in even closer, his hot breath brushing against her ear as he delivered his challenge. "Make me." Chapter 3. The Persistent Pest. Madden spent the entire following day in a state of nervous anticipation, jumping at every shadow and flinching whenever a door slammed in the distance. She was certain the royal guards would march in at any moment to drag her away for treason, or perhaps just for general insolence. But the day passed with agonizing slowness, and no punishment arrived. By the time night fell and her shift in the archives began, she was a frayed wire of nerves. She tried to convince herself that the king had simply forgotten her, that she was too insignificant to warrant his continued attention. She told herself he had likely laughed off the encounter and moved on to more important matters of state. She was wrong. Precisely at midnight, the heavy double doors of the library creaked open. Maren did not look up from her desk, hoping that if she remained very still, whoever it was might go away. But the footsteps were unmistakable. They were heavy, deliberate, and heading straight for her section of the room. Valerius did not go to the upper balcony this time. Instead, he pulled out a chair at the long reading table directly across from her desk. He sat down with a heavy sigh, stretching his long legs out and crossing his boots at the ankles. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at her. He simply pulled a dagger from his belt and a whetstone from his pocket and began to sharpen the blade. Shp, shp, shp. The sound was rhythmic and grating, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere Maren had been trying to cultivate. She gritted her teeth, keeping her eyes glued to the scroll in front of her, determined not to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Valerius paused, hummed a low, tuneless melody that sounded more like a vibration than a song, and then resumed the sharpening. He was doing it on purpose. It was a game, a test to see if she would snap again. The audacity of it was staggering. Here was the most powerful man in the kingdom, ignoring a crucial peace summit to torment a librarian with noise. After an hour of tapping his claws on the wood, shifting his chair loudly, and turning pages of a book he wasn't actually reading, Maren reached her limit. She slammed her quill down into the inkwell, ignoring the splatter of black droplets that hit the parchment. She looked up, meeting his gaze. Valerius was already watching her, his chin resting in his hand, that same dangerous smirk playing on his lips. He looked delighted, his eyes gleaming with a predatory mirth that made her stomach flip. "Is there something you need, Your Majesty?" she asked, her voice tight with suppressed frustration. "Or have you simply decided that the Grand Library is the best place to practice your percussion skills?" Valerius chuckled, a dark sound that seemed to wrap around her. He stood up, sliding the dagger back into its sheath with a decisive click. He walked around the edge of the table, moving with that deceptive speed she had noticed the night before. He didn't stop until he was standing beside her chair, trapping her between the desk and his massive frame. He placed a hand on the back of her chair and leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I find I cannot focus elsewhere," he admitted, though his eyes danced with mockery. "It is too quiet in my chambers. I prefer the view down here." Chapter 4. The Beast's Interest. Valerius Stallone left the library that night with a strange sensation in his chest. Silence. For the first time in weeks, the constant, roaring static of his beast had quieted down to a manageable hum. It was a relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. Since the start of the summit, his inner wolf had been a raging inferno, clawing at the edges of his mind, demanding blood and violence in response to the political posturing of the other alphas. The stress of the negotiations, the scent of deceit from the rival packs, and the constant threat of assassination had pushed his control to its absolute limit. He had gone to the library the previous night, looking for a place to isolate himself before he killed someone, but instead of solitude, he had found something far more interesting. He paced the length of his private chambers, the luxurious rug muffling his steps, his mind replaying the image of the small, defiant Omega. She smelled like old paper and lavender, a soft, unassuming scent that should have meant nothing to him. Yet, when she had stomped her foot and ordered him to hush, his beast had not lunged for her throat. Instead, the wolf had pricked its ears and settled down, fascinated by the creature brave enough to challenge its dominance. It was an anomaly. Alphas, betas, and even other omegas usually cowered before him, their fear rolling off them in nauseating waves. But she had looked him in the eye, her fear present, but secondary to her indignation. He stopped in front of the fireplace, watching the flames lick at the logs. He needed that calm. The summit was only going to get more dangerous in the coming days. Mercer was plotting something. Valerius could smell the treachery on the man, and the other council members were like vultures circling a dying carcass. If Valerius lost control and shifted in the council room, he would prove them right. He would be the monster they all whispered he was. He needed an anchor, something to ground him when the rage became too much. He had tried meditation, physical exertion, and even pain, but nothing had worked as effectively as the sharp tongue of the little librarian. A plan began to form in his mind, ruthless and selfish, but necessary for the stability of the kingdom. He could not spend every night lurking in the archives like a common thief. It was undignified and inefficient. He needed her closer. He needed her within arm's reach, where her strange, calming defiance could act as a buffer between his beast and the rest of the world. He turned away from the fire, his decision made. He would not ask her, of course. Kings did not ask. He would simply rearrange her life to suit his needs. He walked to his desk, pulled out a sheet of royal stationery, and began to write a decree that would drag Marin out of the shadows and straight into the center of the storm. Chapter 5. By Royal Decree. The summons arrived just as Marin was finishing her breakfast of stale toast and tea. It was delivered not by a courier, but by the captain of the royal guard himself, a stern man in polished armor who looked entirely out of place in the cramped hallway of the staff quarters. He handed her the scroll with a look of pity that made Marin's blood run cold. She took the heavy parchment, her hands shaking so badly she could barely break the wax seal. She had been expecting this. She had pushed the king too far with her snark the previous night, and now she was going to pay the price. She unrolled the document, expecting to see an order for her termination or perhaps her exile. Instead, the words swam before her eyes, refusing to make sense. Effective immediately, Archivist Marin is reassigned to the royal wing to serve as the king's personal scribe for the duration of the Grand Summit. She read it twice, then a third time, certain there was a mistake. Personal scribe? The king didn't need a scribe. He had an entire army of secretaries and advisors. This wasn't a promotion. It was a sentence. It meant she would have to leave the safety of the archives and live in the high tower, surrounded by the most dangerous predators in the territory. It meant she would be under his eye, day and night. "You have 10 minutes to pack your belongings," the captain stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The king is expecting you in his study at the top of the hour. Do not keep him waiting." Marin moved like a sleepwalker, throwing her meager possessions into a bag. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Why was he doing this? Was it punishment? A game? Or something worse? She barely remembered the walk through the fortress, her mind racing with escape plans that she knew were impossible to execute. Before she could process the reality of her situation, she was standing in front of the massive double doors of the king's private study. The guards pushed the doors open, and Marin was ushered inside. The room was vast, dominated by dark wood and darker shadows, with a massive fireplace roaring on one wall. Valerius was seated behind a desk that looked like a fortress barricade, sorting through a stack of documents. He didn't look up as she entered, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "You're late," he murmured, the low timbre of his voice wrapping around her. Marin clutched her bag to her chest, trying to find her voice. "Your Majesty, I cannot accept this position. I am an archivist, not a scribe. I have work in the library that—" Valerius finally looked up, his eyes glowing with that same unsettling amusement. He cut her off with a wave of his hand. "The library is too far away," he said simply, as if that explained everything. He stood up and walked around the desk, leaning against the front of it with his arms crossed. "You wanted quiet, Marin. You told me to hush." He took a slow step toward her, his presence filling the room until there was no air left to breathe. "So, I am giving you the chance to ensure it. You are going to sit in this room, organize my chaos, and keep me from roaring at the idiots who run this council. And if you try to run back to your dusty shelves—" He let the sentence hang in the air, a velvet-wrapped threat that made her knees weak. "Well, let's just say I can be very loud when I am displeased." Chapter 6. Into the Lion's Den. Walking into the Grand Summit Hall felt less like entering a diplomatic meeting and more like stepping into a cage filled with starving tigers. The double doors swung open with a theatrical groan, revealing a cavernous space filled with the elite of the shifter world. Chandeliers dripping with crystals cast a fractured light over the velvet-clad crowd, but the luxury did nothing to mask the underlying aggression. Marin kept her head down, clutching her ledger to her chest like a shield, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her simple grey wool dress amidst the silks and furs of the nobility. She trailed a half step behind Valerius, using his massive frame to block the curious and predatory gazes that immediately snapped toward them. The king moved with a terrifying confidence, ignoring the murmurs that rippled through the room like a disturbance in calm water. He was not just attending, he was patrolling his territory, and the tension radiating off him was sharp enough to cut glass. They had barely made it to the centre of the room when a man detached himself from a group of alphas near the wine table. Alpha Mercer was handsome in a slick, serpentine way, his smile not quite reaching his cold eyes. Beside him stood Lady Isolde, a stunning female alpha draped in crimson, looking at Madden as if she were a stain on the carpet. Mercer bowed, a gesture that mocked rather than honoured. He spoke loudly enough for the surrounding groups to hear, his voice dripping with false concern about the king's choice of company. He'd remarked on how unusual it was for the Lycan king to bring a servant to the high table, implying that perhaps Valerius's judgment was finally beginning to fracture under the pressure of his crown. The insult was subtle, wrapped in politeness, but it struck its target with precision. Valerius stopped dead. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. A low rumble started deep in his chest, a sound that Madden felt in the soles of her feet before she heard it. It was the warning sound of a beast preparing to tear a throat out. The guards by the wall tensed, hands drifting to their weapons, and the chatter in the hall died instantly. Valerius's hands curled into fists, his knuckles turning white as he stared Mercer down. The violence was seconds away. Madden could see the shift beginning in the darkening of his irises. She knew she should step back, let the alphas handle their blood feud, but instinct overrode her fear. Without thinking, Madden reached out and placed her small, ink-stained hand on the king's rigid forearm. The contact was electric, a jolt that seemed to freeze time. She squeezed gently, not a restraint, but a reminder. "My lord," she said, her voice soft but cutting clearly through the silence. "The council is waiting for the agenda, and I have the documents ready for your review." It was a mundane statement, completely ignoring the tension, but the effect was instantaneous. Valerius blinked, the red hue fading from his vision as he looked down at her hand on his arm. The growl died in his throat, replaced by a look of profound confusion mixed with dark fascination. He covered her hand with his own large one, not to remove it, but to press it closer to his skin. He turned back to Mercer, his expression now composed and infinitely more terrifying. He offered no retort, simply brushing past the rival alpha as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture, dragging a stunned Marin with him toward the throne. Chapter 7. The Scent of Trouble. The moment the heavy oak doors of the council chamber closed behind them, signaling a recess, Valerius moved. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed Marin's wrist and pulled her into a narrow, stone-walled alcove off the main corridor, away from the prying eyes of the delegates. He backed her against the rough tapestries, his body forming a solid wall that blocked her escape. His breathing was heavy, not from exertion, but from the immense effort it had taken to keep his beast on a leash for the last hour. The adrenaline from the confrontation in the hall was still coursing through him, and he looked at her with a wildness that made her breath hitch. He wasn't angry exactly, but he was overwhelmed, his control hanging by a singular thread. Marin pressed her back against the stone, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She expected him to yell at her for touching him in public, for undermining his authority, or for daring to intervene in a challenge between alphas. Instead, Valerius leaned in, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, a long, shuddering breath that sent shivers racing down her spine. He stayed there for a long moment, simply breathing her in, using her scent to anchor himself. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were heavy-lidded and dark, focused intently on her pulse point. He demanded to know why she hadn't run. Any other Omega would have fled the moment his growl started, yet she had stepped closer. "I didn't think," Marin admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I just didn't want you to give him the satisfaction of seeing you lose control." "That is what he wanted, isn't it?" Valerius braced his hands on the wall on either side of her head, boxing her in. He stared at her, analysing her features as if searching for a deception that wasn't there. He told her she was playing a dangerous game, standing between a wolf and his prey. He reached up, his rough thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a touch that was surprisingly gentle, given the violence simmering just beneath his skin. He confessed that her fear was palpable. He could smell the spike of adrenaline on her skin. But the fact that she acted in spite of it was driving his beast to distraction. The dynamic between them shifted in the shadows of that corridor. It was no longer just king and servant. It was something primal and unspoken. Valerius leaned closer again, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that vibrated against her lips. He warned her that she smelled like rain and old parchment, a scent that was entirely too calm for the chaos of his life. He accused her of bewitching him, of putting a spell on his wolf to make it listen to her commands. Marin found her courage returning, a spark of her usual sass cutting through the tension. She looked him in the eye and told him that perhaps he just wasn't used to people telling him the truth. Valerius laughed, a short, dark sound, and pulled away just as footsteps echoed down the hall, leaving Marin breathless and confused, with the distinct feeling that she had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. Chapter 8. The Failed Assassin. The afternoon sun offered no warmth in the fortress gardens, filtered as it was through the grey, overcast sky that seemed to permanently hang over the summit. Valerius had insisted on a walk to clear his head after hours of circular arguments regarding border treaties, and naturally, Marin was required to accompany him, ledger in hand, noting down his gruff dictations. The garden was a maze of high hedges and stone statues, beautiful, but strategically nightmarish for anyone concerned with security. Marin walked a few paces behind him, struggling to keep her ink pot steady as she scribbled on the parchment. The guards were stationed at the perimeter, giving the king a semblance of privacy, but Marin felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The silence here felt wrong. It was too absolute, lacking the usual chirping of birds or the rustle of wind. The attack happened in a blur of motion that the human eye could barely track. A figure dropped from the high branches of an ancient oak tree, a flash of silver glinting in the dull light. Valerius reacted with supernatural speed, spinning around and catching the assassin's wrist mid-swing, stopping the poisoned blade inches from his chest. The sound of bone snapping echoed through the garden, followed by a wet thud as Valerius threw the attacker to the ground. The king didn't stop there. His control, already frayed from the morning's insults, disintegrated. He descended on the would-be killer with a roar that shook the leaves from the trees, his claws extending, ready to tear the man apart limb from limb, right there on the manicured grass. Marin dropped her ledger, the ink pot shattering on the cobblestones. She saw the guards running from the perimeter, but they would be too late to stop the slaughter. If Valerius killed this man in a feral rage, without interrogation, without due process, Mercer would have all the proof he needed to declare the king unfit. Worse, Valerius would never forgive himself for losing control so completely. Without a weapon or a plan, Marin threw herself into the fray. She didn't attack the assassin. She stepped directly into Valerius's line of sight, placing her small body between the raging lichen and the broken man on the ground. "Valerius!" she shouted, her voice shrill with panic but firm in command. She grabbed the lapels of his coat, forcing him to look down at her instead of the bleeding threat. His eyes were glowing a brilliant, terrifying crimson, his teeth bared in a snarl that promised death. For a second, she thought he wouldn't stop, that he would swipe her aside like a fly. But she held her ground, staring into the abyss of his rage. "Look at me," she ordered, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "Do not do this. Not here. Not like this." The red in his eyes flickered. He breathed heavily, his chest heaving against her hands, the growl in his throat rattling her very bones. Slowly, agonizingly, the beast receded. He blinked, the crimson fading to dark brown, and he looked at her with a mixture of horror and awe, realizing that she had just used her body as a shield to protect his soul. Chapter 9: Rumors and Rivals. The aftermath of the assassination attempt was a whirlwind of security protocols and shouting generals, during which Marin was shunted to the side like forgotten luggage. By evening, the adrenaline had crashed, leaving her feeling hollow and exposed. She sought refuge in the ladies' powder room near the banquet hall, splashing cold water on her face to wash away the memory of the violence. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, pale, wide-eyed, with ink stains on her fingers. She didn't belong here. She was a librarian who liked quiet corners and dusty books, not a woman who stood in front of raging monsters. She was drying her hands when the door opened, and Lady Isolde swept in, accompanied by two of her sycophants. Isolde didn't pretend to be polite this time. She leaned against the vanity, checking her flawless makeup, and spoke to Marin's reflection in the mirror. Her voice was sweet, poisonous honey. She told Marin that it was almost adorable how she thought she was helping the king. She explained with cruel precision that Valerius was known for breaking things. She listed names of previous staff, previous flings, people who had tried to get close to the fire and had been burned to ash. She leaned in close, whispering that Marin was nothing more than a stress ball, a temporary amusement that Valerius would discard the moment she became boring or broken. "He doesn't need a mouse," Isolde hissed, her eyes flashing with amber light. "He needs a queen, and you, my dear, are just prey." Marin fled the room, the laughter of the high-born wolves chasing her down the hall. She marched straight to the king's chambers, her mind made up. She couldn't do this. She couldn't be the target, the shield, and the joke all at once. When she burst into his room, Valerius was pacing, still agitated from the afternoon. He spun around, relief washing over his face when he saw her, but it vanished when she threw the ledger onto his desk. "I resign," she stated, her voice shaking. "I cannot do this. I am not trained for war, I am not a diplomat, and I am certainly not a shield. I want to go back to the archives, please." Valerius stared at the ledger, then at her. His expression hardened, closing off like a steel trap. He walked around the desk, ignoring her plea. He told her that resignation was not an option. He didn't try to comfort her or deny Isolde's words, which only made it hurt more. He simply stated that she was the only thing keeping his head clear, and therefore she was essential. It was a cold, pragmatic assessment that seemed to confirm everything Isolde had said. He picked up a heavy, intricate map from his table and thrust it toward her. "If you want to be useful, stop whining and help me decode this." The assassin carried it. "If we find where he came from, we end this." It was a dismissal of her feelings, but a demand for her mind. Marin hated him in that moment, but she hated the thought of leaving a puzzle unsolved even more. Chapter 10: Late-night studies. The anger in the room was palpable, a third presence sitting between them as they worked. Marin sat on the floor by the fireplace, the massive map spread out on the rug, surrounded by piles of reference books she had demanded be brought up from the library. Valerius sat in his armchair, watching her, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wasn't drinking, he was just watching the way the firelight caught the stray hairs escaping her messy bun. They had been working in silence for 2 hours, the only sounds the turning of pages and the crackle of the logs. It was a tense piece, but it was better than the shouting match that had almost erupted earlier. "It's a dialect from the northern wastes," Marin muttered, breaking the silence. She didn't look up, tracing a line of jagged runes with her finger. "This symbol here isn't a mountain, it's a warning marker for a sulfur mine. And this..." She cross-referenced a symbol with an old geography tome. "This isn't a rallying point, it's a ventilation shaft. They aren't planning to attack the walls, they're planning to come up from beneath the foundation." She looked up, her eyes bright with the thrill of discovery, momentarily forgetting her anger. "Mercer isn't moving troops, he's moving explosives." Valerius set his glass down, the liquid rippling. He slid off the chair to sit on the floor opposite her, leaning over the map. The proximity was sudden and overwhelming. He looked at where she pointed, his sharp mind grasping the tactical implications immediately. He looked up at her, and the cold mask was gone, replaced by a burning intensity that made her breath catch. It wasn't just lust, it was intellectual admiration, a rare and heady thing coming from a man who usually valued brute strength above all else. "You found in 2 hours what my generals couldn't find in 2 weeks, he murmured, his voice low and rough. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the map. His skin was hot, his thumb brushing over her ink-stained knuckles. The atmosphere shifted from academic to intimate in a heartbeat. "You are not a mouse, Marin," he said softly, referencing the insult she hadn't even told him about, proving he heard everything. "You are the most dangerous person in this fortress, because you actually see things." He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. Marin didn't pull away. The intellectual connection had bridged the gap her fear had created. For a moment, amidst the maps and the schemes of war, there was just the fire, the silence, and the king who looked at her as if she were the only answer that mattered. Chapter 11. The Gala Invitation. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when a courier arrived at Marin's temporary quarters in the royal wing, carrying a box large enough to hold a small corpse. Marin stared at the velvet-wrapped container resting on her bed, a sense of dread pooling in her stomach. She had spent the last 2 days decoding the assassin's map, a task that had earned her a grudging respect from the king's generals and a terrifying amount of heated stares from the king himself. She had hoped that her contribution to national security would allow her to fade back into the background, perhaps returning to the comfortable obscurity of the archives. But Valerius Stallone was not a man who let things go, and the contents of the box confirmed that her wish for invisibility was about to be violently denied. She lifted the lid, revealing a cascade of crimson silk that shimmered like fresh blood in the morning light. It was a gown, intricately embroidered with gold thread in the pattern of thorny vines, a garment designed not just to be worn, but to make a statement. Nestled on top was a note, written in Valerius's bold, slashing handwriting. "For the grand gala tonight, wear it. Do not be late." Marin dropped the lid as if it burned her fingers. The grand gala was the culmination of the summit, a pit of vipers where every high-born shifter in the territory gathered to drink wine and sharpen their knives against each other's backs. The idea of walking into that room, draped in the king's colors, was nauseating. It was a declaration of ownership, a target painted on her back for people like Lady Isolde to aim at. Marin marched down the corridor to the king's study, clutching the note in her hand. She found Valerius standing by the window, looking out over the training grounds. He turned as she entered, his eyes immediately dropping to the paper in her hand, a smug satisfaction curling the corner of his mouth. Before he could speak, Marin slammed the note onto his desk. "I am not going," she declared, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I am a scribe, Your Majesty. My place is with the records, not parading around a ballroom in a dress that costs more than my entire village. You have generals to intimidate. You do not need me there." Valerius walked over to the desk, picking up the note and smoothing it out with deliberate care. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes dancing with that familiar, maddening amusement. He told her that he required her attendance precisely because she hated it. He explained that her presence unsettled his enemies because they could not figure out what she was to him. Was she a pet? A spy? A weakness? The confusion kept them off balance. Marin crossed her arms, refusing to budge. She argued that she would faint from anxiety within the hour, rendering her useless. Valerius leaned forward, bracing his hands on the desk, and offered a compromise that sounded more like a trap. "Fine," he rumbled. "A wager. You claim you want peace and quiet. If you can make me sit in silence, total meditation, no speaking, no moving, for 1 full hour, I will let you skip the gala. But if you fail to keep me quiet, you wear the dress." Chapter 12. The Meditation Challenge. The terms of the wager were simple, but the execution was proving to be a nightmare. They were in Valerius's private sanctuary, a room designed for tranquility, with plush cushions and dim lighting, yet the atmosphere was crackling with static energy. Valerius sat cross-legged on the floor, his eyes closed, breathing deeply in a pantomime of meditation. Marin sat opposite him, holding a stopwatch, watching him like a hawk. The first 10 minutes had passed in relative silence, and she had foolishly begun to hope that she might actually win. She should have known better. Valerius was not a creature of stillness. He was kinetic energy wrapped in skin, and he had absolutely no intention of playing fair. It started with a hum, a low, vibrating sound deep in his chest that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a growl. It was just loud enough to be annoying. Marin glared at him. "Quiet," she hissed. Valerius smirked without opening his eyes, and the humming stopped, only to be replaced by a rhythmic tapping of his claws against his knee. Click, click, click. The sound echoed in the quiet room, grating on her nerves. Marin reached out and placed her hand over his to stop the tapping. His skin was searingly hot, and the moment she touched him, he flipped his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. He didn't speak, so technically he wasn't breaking the rules, but the thumb stroking the sensitive skin of her palm was definitely a violation of the spirit of the game. "You are cheating," Marin whispered, trying to pull her hand away, but his grip was ironclad. Valerius opened one eye, the gold iris gleaming with mischief. He didn't say a word. He just leaned forward, invading her personal space until she had to lean back to maintain eye contact. He used his free hand to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on the curve of her neck. His heart rate wasn't slowing down for meditation. It was speeding up, a heavy, rhythmic thudding that she could hear in the silence. He was weaponizing his presence, using his sheer, overwhelming masculinity to fluster her into breaking the silence herself. Marin tried to hold her ground, tried to order him to retreat, but the words caught in her throat. Valerius leaned in closer, his nose brushing against hers, and let out a soft, sharp exhale that smelled of mint and wood smoke. He raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge. If she spoke again to scold him, she would be the one breaking the quiet. If she moved, she lost. He knew exactly which buttons to push. He shifted his weight, his knee brushing against hers, and the friction sent a jolt of heat straight to her core. Maren gasped, the sound loud in the room. Valerius grinned, finally breaking his silence. "That sounded like a noise to me, little librarian," he murmured, his voice rough with victory. "I believe that means you have a dress to put on." Chapter 13. The Lady in Red. The ballroom was a sea of jewels, furs, and calculated whispers, but the moment the herald announced the king's arrival, the sea parted. Maren stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting on Valerius's arm, wishing the marble floor would open up and swallow her whole. The crimson dress fit like a second skin, the corset structured to give her confidence she didn't feel, forcing her posture straight and her head high. She could feel the weight of 100 stares hitting her all at once: judgment, envy, confusion. Valerius, in stark contrast, looked entirely at ease in his formal military dress black, the dark fabric making the crimson of her gown pop like a fresh wound. He placed his hand over hers, his grip warm and reassuring, grounding her when she felt like she might float away on a tide of panic. They descended the stairs in silence, the only sound the rustle of silk and the heavy thud of Valerius's boots. As they reached the floor, the orchestra hesitated, then swept into a waltz. Valerius didn't wait for pleasantries. He turned to her, bowing low with a mockery of courtly grace, and swept her onto the dance floor. "Breathe," he commanded softly, pulling her flush against his chest, far closer than was proper for mixed company. "If you faint, I will have to carry you, and that will only cause more gossip." Maren followed his lead, her feet moving automatically to the count of 3. She was a good dancer, her grandmother had insisted on lessons, but dancing with Valerius was like dancing with a thunderstorm. He was powerful, leading her with subtle shifts of his body that demanded total surrender. "Everyone is staring," Maren whispered, keeping her gaze fixed on the medals pinned to his chest to avoid looking at the crowd. "They are wondering why the king is dancing with the archivist." Valerius spun her around, his hand sliding lower on her back, fingers splaying over the silk. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Let them wonder," he growled, his voice dropping to that dangerous, intimate register that made her knees weak. "I am wondering how quickly I can get you out of this dress and back to my chambers, so I can see if you blush all over." Maren's face flamed, heat rushing to her cheeks. She gripped his shoulder, her fingers digging into the fabric of his jacket. "Valerius," she hissed, scandalized. "Be quiet." The command slipped out automatically, a reflex born of their private dynamic. Valerius laughed, a low rumble that vibrated against her chest. Instead of obeying, he nipped her earlobe, a sharp, possessive bite that was visible to anyone watching. "Make me," he whispered back, the challenge clear. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the hall. He had just marked her, publicly and undeniably. The game of silence had just become a spectacle of possession, and Maren realized with a jolt that there was no going back to the shadows now. Chapter 14. The Public Challenge. The music stopped abruptly, not with a flourish, but with a discordant screech, as the conductor dropped his baton. The murmurs in the hall died down into a tense, expectant silence. Maren and Valerius were still in the center of the floor, the moment of intimacy shattered by the sudden shift in atmosphere. From the eastern entrance, Alpha Mercer strode in, flanked by 4 of his lieutenants. He wasn't wearing formal dress. He was wearing the ceremonial armor of a challenger. The festive mood evaporated instantly, replaced by the metallic taste of impending violence. Valerius released Marin slowly, pushing her gently behind him, his body shifting from lover to warrior in the blink of an eye. Mercer stopped 10 paces away, his voice booming through the silent hall. He didn't attack with a sword, he attacked with words, weaponizing the scene the court had just witnessed. He called out to the High Council, pointing an accusing finger at Valerius. He claimed that the king was compromised, that his beast had become unstable, driven to madness by an unnatural obsession with a weakling Omega. He gestured to Marin, calling her a distraction, a symptom of Valerius's declining mental state. He argued that a king who could not control his primal urges in a ballroom could not be trusted to lead armies in the field. It was a coup, staged as a concern for the welfare of the kingdom. Valerius stood rigid, his shoulders shaking with the effort to suppress the change. A low, continuous growl emitted from his chest, a sound that made the crystal glasses on the nearby tables tremble. His eyes began to bleed into that terrifying crimson, the whites disappearing as the wolf fought to surface. Mercer grinned, seeing his victory. He wanted Valerius to shift. If the king turned into a beast and attacked an unarmed council member in the middle of a gala, he would be put down like a rabid dog. "Look at him," Mercer shouted, playing to the crowd. "He is feral. He cannot even speak to defend himself." Marin watched Valerius's hands curl into claws, the leather of his gloves splitting under the pressure. He was losing. The insults to her didn't matter, but the accusation of madness was hitting his core wound, the fear that he truly was a monster. The guards were frozen, unsure of who to obey. The court watched with bated breath, waiting for the bloodbath. Valerius took a step forward, a roar building in his throat that would seal his fate. He was falling right into the trap, blinded by rage, ready to tear Mercer apart and lose his crown in the process. Chapter 15. The Defense. Before the first claw could strike, a splash of red moved between the two alphas. Marin stepped out from behind Valerius, placing herself directly in his path. She didn't look at the king, she looked straight at Mercer. The hall went deathly quiet. It was unheard of for an Omega to interfere in an alpha challenge. Mercer scoffed, opening his mouth to dismiss her, but Marin spoke first. Her voice was not loud, but it was projected with the clear, crisp diction of someone who had spent her life reciting facts. According to Article 4, Section 12 of the Pack Treaty of 1894, she began, reciting the law from memory, a challenge to the king's mental fitness cannot be issued based on behavioral conjecture. It must be substantiated by a documented failure of command or a violation of territory. She took a step toward Mercer, the crimson dress rustling like dry leaves. You claim the king is unstable because he favors an Omega. Yet, under King Valerius's rule, the border raids have decreased by 40%. The treasury is full. The peace treaty you are currently trying to sabotage is the most comprehensive in a century. She turned to the crowd, addressed the council members directly. Is affection a crime? Or is Alpha Mercer simply confusing his own ambition with the king's competence? She spun back to Mercer, her eyes flashing with a fierce intelligence. You call him feral. I call him a leader who identified a traitor plotting to bomb this very foundation and stopped him without shedding innocent blood. Or did you think we hadn't decoded the map you paid for, Mercer? The accusation hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Mercer turned pale, his arrogance faltering. Behind Marin, the growling stopped. Valerius blinked, the red receding from his vision as the fog of rage was pierced by the sharp clarity of her defense. She wasn't fighting with teeth. She was fighting with the one thing he couldn't use, the truth. She had just publicly outmaneuvered a warlord with nothing but a library book and a spine of steel. The crowd began to murmur, the tide turning as the logic of her words sank in. Marin felt a large, warm hand settle on her shoulder. She looked back and up, meeting Valerius's gaze. There was no madness there now, only a terrifying intensity of a different kind. He looked at her not as a pet or a distraction, but as his equal, his savior. He stepped up beside her, presenting a united front that was impenetrable. He didn't need to roar. He looked at Mercer, who was now being surrounded by the royal guard on Valerius's silent signal. "You heard the lady," Valerius said, his voice calm, deep, and utterly final. "She speaks for me." He looked down at Marin, his hand sliding up to cup the back of her neck, his thumb resting on her pulse. "And she is mine." Chapter 16. The First Kiss. The adrenaline coursing through Valerius's veins was a potent drug, sharper and more intoxicating than any wine served at the gala. He did not give the court time to process the shift in power, nor did he wait for Mercer to be dragged away by the guards. His focus had narrowed down to the single point of gravity that kept him tethered to the earth, the woman in the crimson dress. He gripped Marin's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers so tightly it bordered on pain, and pulled her toward the balcony doors. They burst out into the cool night, leaving the suffocating heat of the ballroom behind. But the temperature outside did little to cool the fire burning beneath his skin. He didn't stop until they were at the far edge of the stone terrace, secluded by the shadows of the climbing ivy, the sounds of the party muffled behind the thick glass. Valerius spun her around, pressing her back against the rough stone balustrade. He looked down at her, his chest heaving as he fought to regulate his breathing. The beast was still prowling just beneath the surface, agitated not by anger this time, but by a fierce, overwhelming pride. He had expected her to cower, to run, or to hide behind him. Instead, she had stood before a council of war-hardened alphas and dismantled their arguments with nothing but logic and a terrifying amount of courage. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and reflecting the moonlight, her breathing matching his erratic rhythm. She looked beautiful and entirely too fragile to be holding the leash of a king, yet that is exactly what she had done. "You are insane," Valerius murmured, his voice rough and scraping against the silence. He raised a hand, his thumb tracing the curve of her bottom lip, marveling at the softness of the mouth that had just delivered such a scathing defense. "You stood between two alphas on the brink of a death match. Do you have any idea how close I was to tearing him apart? Do you have any concept of the danger you put yourself in?" He wasn't scolding her. The words were a confession of his own terror. The thought of Mercer striking her, of her getting caught in the crossfire of his own rage, made his blood run cold. Marin didn't flinch. She reached up, her small hands resting on the lapels of his uniform, grounding him. "I knew you wouldn't hurt me," she whispered, her voice steady. "And I knew you weren't mad. You were just loud. Someone had to tell them." The simplicity of her faith in him broke the last of his restraint. Valerius let out a low groan, a sound of surrender, and crashed his mouth down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a claiming. He devoured her, pouring all the fear, the rage, and the adoration of the last hour into the contact. His hands tangled in her hair, destroying the intricate style, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss until they were both gasping for air. Marin met him with equal fervor, her hands clutching his shoulders, pulling him closer, as if she could merge her soul with his. For the first time in his life, the noise in Valerius's head vanished completely, replaced by the singular, perfect sensation of her. Chapter 17. The Sabotage. The hours following the gala were a blur of triumphant toasts and weary relief. With Mercer detained in the holding cells pending a formal inquiry into the assassination plot, the tension that had gripped the fortress for weeks finally began to dissipate. Valerius felt a strange lightness in his chest, a sensation he eventually identified as hope. He retired to his private study, dismissing his guards for the night, needing a moment of solitude to process the shift in his reality. Marin had gone to her own quarters to change out of the crimson gown, promising to return to help him draft the official report for the council. Valerius poured himself a goblet of dark vintage wine from the carafe on his side table, the crystal clinking softly in the quiet room. He took a long drink, savoring the rich, heavy taste, allowing his muscles to finally relax. But the relaxation was short-lived. Within minutes, a strange heat began to bloom in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't the pleasant warmth of alcohol. It was a searing, acidic burn that spread rapidly through his veins. Valerius frowned, setting the goblet down with a shaking hand. He rubbed his chest, thinking it was just the after effects of the adrenaline crash, or perhaps the beast reacting to the separation from Marin. But the heat intensified, turning into a clawing, frantic energy that scraped against the inside of his skull. His vision blurred, the edges of the room warping and twisting, as if he were looking through a funhouse mirror. A sudden, irrational spike of paranoia slammed into him. Why was the room so quiet? Where were the guards? Why hadn't Marin returned? He stood up, intending to go to the door, but his legs buckled beneath him. He crashed into the side table, sending the crystal carafe shattering to the floor. The sound was deafening, exploding in his sensitive ears like a cannon blast. The noise triggered a violent, instinctual response. His beast didn't just surface. It tore through the mental barriers he had spent centuries erecting. It wasn't a natural shift. It was forced, chemical, and agonizing. He realized with a jolt of horror that he had been poisoned. It wasn't a lethal toxin meant to stop his heart. It was a feral stimulant, a banned substance designed to drive a shifter into a mindless, bloodthirsty rage. Mercer's backup plan had been executed perfectly. Valerius clawed at his collar, ripping the fabric as he fought for breath. The walls seemed to be closing in on him, the shadows morphing into enemies. His mind fractured, logic dissolving into a red haze of pure aggression. He needed to get out. He needed to kill something. No, he needed to protect her. The thought of Marin flashed through the chaos. She was coming back here. She was walking straight into the den of a monster. He let out a roar that shook the stone foundations of the tower, a sound of pure agony and warning. He had to lock himself away before she arrived. He had to bury the beast deep in the earth, where it couldn't hurt the only thing that mattered. Chapter 18. The Poison. The transformation was absolute and terrifying. The man who was King Valerius Stallone ceased to exist, replaced by a creature of nightmare, driven by chemical madness. The study, once a place of order and strategy, was reduced to splinters and shredded fabric within moments. The massive oak desk was overturned with a single swipe of a clawed hand, papers fluttering down like snow in the wreckage. Valerius, or the thing that wore his skin, paced the ruins, snarling at invisible attackers. The toxin distorted his senses, turning the familiar scent of the fortress into the stench of burning flesh and betrayal. Every shadow looked like an assassin. Every sound was a threat. The beast wanted to hunt, to tear, to silence the screaming noise in its head with blood. Yet, a tiny fragment of the man remained, buried deep under the avalanche of rage. It was a singular, desperate command: protect her. The hallucination shifted. He saw Marin standing in the doorway, not as she was, but covered in blood, broken by his own hands. The vision broke him. He howled, a sound of such despair that it cracked the window panes. He couldn't be here. He couldn't be anywhere near people. He threw himself at the heavy wooden door, smashing it off its hinges with a shoulder check that shattered bone. He didn't run toward the staff quarters. He ran toward the dungeons. He barreled through the corridors, a blur of fur and muscle, knocking aside guards who were too terrified to engage him. He didn't attack them. He ignored them, focused solely on his destination. He reached the heavy iron grate that separated the royal levels from the deep containment cells, the cages built for traitors and monsters. He ripped the grate open, the metal screeching in protest, and descended into the darkness. He found the deepest, strongest cell, a vault of stone and reinforced steel designed to hold high-level threats. He threw himself inside, collapsing onto the damp stone floor. "Lock it!" he roared at the terrified guards who had followed him down, his voice a distorted, guttural rasp that barely sounded human. "Lock the door and throw away the key. If anyone opens this door, I will kill them. Do it." The guards, pale and shaking, scrambled to obey. The heavy tumblers of the lock slammed home, sealing him in the dark. Valerius slumped against the far wall, his body convulsing as the full transformation took hold. The pain was blinding, but it was a relief compared to the alternative. He was caged. She was safe. He surrendered to the madness, letting the red tide swallow him whole, praying that the poison would kill him before he could ever hurt her. Chapter 19. Locked Out. Marin was halfway down the corridor, balancing a tray of tea and sandwiches, when the roar tore through the silence of the night. It wasn't the rumbling growl she had grown accustomed to. This was a sound of unadulterated suffering, a scream of a soul being ripped in two. The tray slipped from her numb fingers, the porcelain shattering on the stone floor. She didn't look down. She ran. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she sprinted toward the king's study, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. Had Mercer escaped? Had the assassin returned? She burst into the study and skidded to a halt, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The room was destroyed. It looked as though a tornado had materialized in the center of the tower. "Valerius?" she called out, stepping over the ruins of his desk. The room was empty, but the scent of ozone and distress was thick enough to taste. A group of guards appeared in the doorway, their weapons drawn, faces pale with terror. It was the captain of the guard, the same man who had escorted her here days ago. He looked shaken to his core. Marin grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Where is he? What happened?" The captain hesitated, looking at the destruction. He has gone to the lower levels, Miss Marin. He ordered us to lock him in the containment cells. He is not himself. The healers say it looks like feral toxin." The world tilted on its axis. Feral toxin was a death sentence, a chemical that stripped a shifter of their humanity permanently, if not treated immediately. "You locked him in?" Marin demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "He needs a healer. He needs an antidote." The captain shook his head grimly. "We cannot get close enough to administer anything. He is fully shifted and lethal. He threatened to kill anyone who enters. The protocol for feral toxin is containment until the subject expires." Marin stared at him, horror replaced by a cold, hard fury. They were going to let him die in the dark because they were afraid of the noise. They saw a monster. She saw the man who had let her win a meditation wager just to see her smile. "Protocol be damned," she snapped. "Give me the keys." The captain stepped back, holding his hands up. "I cannot do that. It is suicide. He will not recognize you." Maren didn't argue. She saw the heavy ring of keys hanging from his belt. She didn't have the strength to fight him, but she had the element of surprise. She snatched a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby shelf and swung it with all her might, not at the captain, but at a vase behind him. As he flinched and turned toward the noise, she lunged, unhooked the keys with practiced dexterity, and bolted for the door before he could realize what she had done. "Do not follow me," she screamed back at them. "That is a royal command." Chapter 20. Into the Cage. The descent into the dungeons was like walking into the throat of a beast. The air grew colder and damper with every step, heavy with the metallic tang of rust and the underlying scent of ancient fear. The silence that Maren usually craved was absent here. The space was filled with the echoing, rhythmic thudding of a massive body slamming against stone walls, accompanied by snarls that made her knees tremble. She forced herself to keep moving, clutching the heavy iron keyring to her chest like a talisman. The guards at the lower checkpoint tried to stop her, but the sheer insanity of her glare, combined with the keys in her hand, made them hesitate long enough for her to slip past. She reached the final corridor. The door to the containment cell was a massive slab of reinforced steel with a small, barred viewing port. Through the bars, she could see nothing but shadow, but the noise was deafening. Inside, something massive was tearing at the stones, desperate to escape its own skin. Maren stood before the door, her hand shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock. She took a deep breath, visualizing the man who had sharpened a dagger in her library just to annoy her. He was still in there. He had to be. She turned the key. The mechanism clanked loudly, a sound that cut through the growling inside. The slamming against the walls stopped instantly. Maren pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. The cell was pitch black, save for the faint light filtering in from the hallway. In the far corner, 2 glowing red eyes stared at her from the darkness. As her eyes adjusted, the form of the lichen materialized. He was monstrous, easily twice the size of a normal wolf, with fur as black as the void and claws that scraped sparks against the stone floor. The beast lowered its head, a low, vibrating rumble emitting from its chest that shook Maren's bones. It crouched, muscles coiling, preparing to spring. It did not know her. It saw only an intruder, a target. The guards outside were shouting now, realizing she was inside, preparing their crossbows to shoot through the viewing port if the beast attacked. Maren didn't look at them. She didn't back down. She took a step toward the monster, leaving herself completely open, completely vulnerable. She raised her hand, palm out, not in defense, but in greeting. The wolf snarled, snapping its jaws inches from her face, hot saliva hitting her cheek. Maren didn't flinch. She looked straight into the glowing red eyes and spoke the only words that mattered. "Valerius," she whispered, her voice steady and commanding in the echoing dark. "That is enough noise. Be quiet." Chapter 21. Be quiet. The command hung in the damp, stagnant air of the cell, a fragile thing against the overwhelming violence radiating from the creature before her. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the drip of condensation from the ceiling and the ragged, wet breathing of the beast. The lichen did not immediately submit. Instead, it recoiled as if struck, shaking its massive head from side to side. The red glow in its eyes flared brighter, a chaotic fire fueled by the chemical burn of the toxin. It snarled again, a sound that was less a threat and more a cry of confusion, its claws scraping deep gouges into the stone floor as it paced a tight, agitated circle. The guards outside were shouting orders to shoot, the metallic click of crossbow bolts sliding into place echoing through the viewing port. Marin knew she had seconds before they filled the cell with tranquilizers, or worse, lethal iron-tipped bolts, that would end Valerius's life. "Hold your fire!" she screamed at the door without turning around, her voice cracking with the strain. She turned her attention back to the monster, forcing her feet to move forward. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to curl into a ball, to hide from the apex predator that could snap her spine with a casual swipe. But she focused on the specific pattern of the scar running down the beast's muzzle, the same scar that Valerius carried on his jaw. She focused on the intelligence buried deep behind the madness in those eyes. She took another step, closing the distance until she was within striking range. The wolf froze, its body lowering into a crouch, muscles coiling like steel springs. It bared its teeth, snapping the air inches from her outstretched hand, a warning that the animal brain was still in control. Marin did not pull back. She let out a shaky breath and spoke again, pitching her voice lower, matching the frequency of the growl she had heard in the library so many nights ago. "I know you are in there," she whispered, her hand hovering just above the coarse black fur of his snout. "I know it hurts. I know the noise is loud. But you have to listen to me." The wolf flinched, its ears twitching. The familiar cadence of her voice, the scent of lavender and old paper that clung to her skin, began to penetrate the red haze. It was a scent associated with quiet, with safety, with the only peace he had known in weeks. The growling stuttered, breaking into a confused whine. Marin seized the moment. She pressed her palm firmly against the bridge of his nose, physically grounding him. The heat radiating from him was intense, burning her skin, but she didn't let go. "Valerius," she said firmly, pouring every ounce of her will into the name. "Quiet down. Come back to me." The effect was instantaneous and violent. The beast shuddered, a full-body convulsion that knocked Marin to her knees. He collapsed onto his side, writhing as the magic of the shift took over, bones cracking and reshaping in a gruesome display of biology rewriting itself. The massive black fur receded, revealing pale, sweat-slicked skin. Within moments, Valerius lay on the cold stone floor, naked and shivering, the red fading from his eyes to leave them a dark, terrified brown. He gasped for air, his hand blindly reaching out until his fingers brushed her knee. "Marin?" he croaked, his voice wrecked. "Run." Chapter 22. The Vulnerability. Consciousness returned to Valerius in jagged, painful fragments. The first thing he registered was the blinding white light of the infirmary, followed immediately by the sharp, sterile smell of medicinal herbs and disinfectant. His body felt as though it had been put through a meat grinder. Every muscle ached, and his head throbbed with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He tried to sit up, but a heavy hand pushed him back down. He blinked, his vision clearing to reveal the face of the royal healer, looking grim and exhausted. Memories of the previous night crashed into him with the force of a physical blow. The poison, the madness, the dungeon. And then the most terrifying memory of all, Marin walking into the cage. Panic surged through him, cold and absolute. He shoved the healer aside and sat up, ignoring the room spinning around him. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice a raw rasp. "Is she hurt? Did I hurt her?" He scanned the room wildly, expecting to see her bandaged, or worse, not there at all. He saw her sitting in a chair by the window, asleep, her head resting awkwardly on her arm. She was unharmed, though pale and dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. The relief that washed over him was so intense it was nauseating. He slumped back against the pillows, closing his eyes. He had almost killed her. The one person he had sworn to protect had walked into a death trap because he had been too weak to control his own mind. Maren stirred, waking at the sound of his movement. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and offered him a tentative, tired smile. "You're awake," she said softly, standing up to come to his bedside. Valerius couldn't look at her. He stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched tight. "Get out," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Maren froze halfway to the bed. "What?" she asked, confusion coloring her tone. Valerius turned his head to look at her, forcing his expression into a mask of cold indifference. He had to make her leave. He had to send her so far away that his monsters could never reach her again. "You are relieved of your duties," he stated, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "I do not need a scribe who lacks the sense to stay out of a cage. Pack your things and return to your village. The captain will arrange your transport within the hour." Maren stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then, to his utter shock, she laughed. It wasn't a happy sound, but it was defiant. She walked right up to the bed, grabbed the pitcher of water from the side table, and poured a glass, slamming it down within his reach. "You are a terrible liar, Valerius," she told him, crossing her arms. "And you are an idiot if you think I am leaving now." Valerius growled, a warning sound that usually sent grown men running. "I almost ripped you apart," he shouted, the facade cracking. "I am a danger to you. Go!" Maren leaned over the bed, getting right in his face, mirroring the aggression he had shown her in the library. "You didn't hurt me," she snapped back. "You listened to me. You came back for me. So you can growl and order me around all you want, but I am not going anywhere. I love you, you loud, stubborn oaf, and I am not leaving you to handle these vipers alone." Chapter 23. The Traitors Revealed. The Grand Council chamber was packed to capacity, the air vibrating with a nervous energy that bordered on hysteria. Rumors had flown through the fortress all morning, that the king was dead, that he was permanently feral, that the Omega scribe had been eaten. When the heavy doors swung open, the silence that fell was absolute. Valerius walked in, not as a broken invalid, but as a king in his prime. He wore his full ceremonial armor, his face pale but composed, his expression one of icy, controlled fury. At his side, dressed in a gown of deep midnight blue, walked Maren. She did not walk behind him this time. She walked beside him, clutching a sheaf of documents that held the fate of their enemies. Alpha Mercer stood in the center of the room, flanked by Lady Isolde. They looked confident, expecting a feral beast or a corpse to be wheeled in. When they saw Valerius walking steadily, their smiles faltered. Mercer recovered quickly, puffing out his chest. "We are glad to see you recovered, Your Majesty," Mercer lied smoothly. "However, the question of your stability remains. The incident last night proves you are unfit to—" Valerius raised a single hand. He didn't speak. He didn't roar. He just waited. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, until Mercer faltered, his voice trailing off. Valerius turned to Marin and nodded. She stepped forward, opening the file she carried. Her voice rang out clear and precise, echoing off the stone walls. "This is a purchase order from an apothecary in the southern shadow markets," she began, holding up a parchment. "It details the sale of 3 vials of sanguis fera, feral toxin. The order is signed by a proxy, but the payment—" She pulled out a second sheet, a bank transfer record. "The payment originated from the personal accounts of House Mercer." A gasp rippled through the room. Isolde stepped forward, her face twisting. "That is a forgery! You cannot prove—" "I can," Marin interrupted, pulling out the final piece of evidence, the map they had decoded together. "Because the courier you hired to deliver the poison used the same supply routes marked on this map, which was found on the failed assassin. We cross-referenced the travel times with the gate logs you tried to erase." She looked at Isolde with a cool, detached pity. "I am an archivist, Lady Isolde. I find things that people try to hide. That is my job." Valerius stepped forward, placing a hand on Marin's shoulder, presenting a united front. He looked at Mercer, who was now trembling, not with rage, but with fear. The council guards moved in, surrounding the conspirators. Valerius spoke, his voice low and deadly calm. "There will be no duel," he announced, denying Mercer the warrior's death he craved. "To duel you would be to treat you as an equal. You are a traitor and a poisoner." He looked at the guards. "Strip them of their titles, exile them to the wastes. If they return to my territory, they are to be hunted as rogue wolves." As Mercer and Isolde were dragged screaming from the hall, Valerius looked down at Marin. He didn't smile, but his eyes were warm, shining with a pride that was louder than any roar. He had kept his beast silent, just as she had taught him, and the victory was absolute. Chapter 24. Make Me. 2 weeks had passed since the trial, and the Summit Fortress had finally returned to a semblance of normalcy. The delegates had gone home, the treaties were signed, and the winter snows had begun to fall, blanketing the castle in white silence. For Marin, normalcy meant returning to the one place where she felt truly at home, the Grand Library. She sat at her old desk, surrounded by stacks of finalized records that needed to be filed. The lamp cast a warm yellow glow over the parchment, and the only sound was the scratching of her quill. It was peaceful. It was perfect, and she knew it wasn't going to last. Right on cue, the heavy double doors creaked open. Marin didn't look up, a small smile playing on her lips as she continued to write. The heavy, deliberate footsteps approached her desk, stopping just at the edge of her vision. Then, the noise began. Tap, tap, tap. A claw clicked rhythmically against the polished wood of the table. Then came the humming, a deep, resonant vibration that was intentionally off-key. Marin counted to 3, finishing her sentence before she laid down her quill. She looked up to find King Valerius sitting on the edge of her desk, looking entirely too pleased with himself. He was dressed in casual riding leathers, his hair wind-blown, looking every inch the rogue rather than the ruler. "You are disrupting the archives, Your Majesty," Marin said, trying to maintain a stern expression, though her eyes gave her away. "I believe I have told you before that this is a place of study, not a playground for bored alphas." Valerius leaned forward, bracing his hands on either side of her hips, trapping her in her chair. The playful glint in his eyes darkened into something more intense, the same look he had given her the night of the gala. "It is entirely too quiet in the castle," he complained, his voice dropping to a seductive rumble. "I find I cannot think without my personal scribe telling me what to do." Marin raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were the king who commanded silence." Valerius chuckled, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box, not red this time, but deep blue, the color of the dress she had worn when they won the kingdom back. He opened it to reveal a ring of twisted white gold, set with a rare moonstone that seemed to hold its own light. "I discovered," he said softly, his thumb brushing her cheek, "that silence is only bearable if I am sharing it with you." He slid off the desk, dropping to one knee on the dusty floorboards, disregarding his status completely. The playfulness vanished, replaced by a raw sincerity that took Marin's breath away. "Marin," he said, holding the ring up, "you are the only person in the world who can quiet the noise in my head. I promise to listen to you for the rest of my life, mostly, if you will agree to be my queen." Marin felt tears prick her eyes, her heart swelling until she thought it might burst. She looked down at the man who had terrified nations but knelt before her. She took the ring from the box, slipping it onto her finger herself. She grabbed his lapels and pulled him up until they were nose to nose. "I thought I told you to be quiet," she whispered against his lips. Valerius grinned, the beast purring happily in his chest. "Make me," he challenged. Marin kissed him, effectively silencing the king, and for once, neither of them made a sound.